AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a Democratic Party congressperson from the 14th District in New York, which is Brooklyn, part of the Bronx, and I think Queens, I'm not sure. It's a low-income, largely Hispanic area. She's Puerto Rican background. She was a member of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. In an earlier video, I talked about them. The DSA has had explosive growth around the time of the first Sanders campaign. They probably claim to be around 70,000 people. Active members are probably much less. Earlier video, I kind of talked about them a little bit, and I interviewed Doug Green, talking about Michael Harrington, the founder. The DSA is basically a faction of the Democratic Party. They have caucuses and internal factions and groups and debates and stuff, but none of them really are breaking from the Democratic Party. They maybe locally do some worthwhile activism in some areas, but ultimately they function as part of the Democratic Party. And I think we need to solidly break from that. Anyway, AOC is, she's popularly called, was a member of the DSA. It's unclear her current association. I mean, to be in the DSA, all you have to do is pay $60 or $5 a month, and you're a member. It's unclear. I doubt she's disassociated herself from it recently. She backed away. I don't think she goes to meetings or whatever, and they have no control, no discipline whatsoever over her. They enthusiastically support her, but they have no control over her. Okay. She ran against the Democratic primary against Joe Crowley, who was a machine Democratic politician. He was a 10-term congressman. He kept going because, no one votes in the primaries, nobody cares. And low-income people rightfully are disengaged, rightfully see the mainstream politics has nothing for them, so who cares? And Joe Crowley was a white guy, nothing. I don't think he did much for his for his district. So she had like an upset victory, and she won in the general election. And she got a lot of publicity as a Democratic socialist. I to blunt, I think she's a fraud. She's gotten a lot of excitement, a lot of publicity, but I think she's a fraud. First of all, she voted for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House first time. She called Pelosi Mama Bear. And which is, originally she said she wasn't going to do that. Some of her earlier takes said, no, I'm not going to vote. I will never vote for Pelosi. They didn't. Pelosi is far right wing, blocks Medicare for all, blocks anything progressive, famous for that. So she voted for Pelosi, called Pelosi Mama Bear, famously. She had shortly after she got in, she had this protest in front of Pelosi's office with the Sunrise Movement. It recently came out that Pelosi knew about it. It was a stunt. Pelosi knew about it. AOC is building her own brand. She actually apparently supported the coup attempts in Venezuela. Someone asked her how she felt about it. Well, she said, I defer to party leadership. Well, party leadership supports the coup. First, the coup in Bolivia, she apparently tried to have it both ways. She retweeted a tweet by Sanders, which came out strong. Bernie Sanders just came out strongly against the coup, but at the same time, she had herself photographed with a golpistas, a coup, holding a coup flag. She knew what she was doing. She definitely knew what she was doing. She kind of tried to have it both ways. If she was really opposing these coups, she should have said it very loudly. This is horrible. This is a human rights abuse. This is horrible U.S. imperialism, but she was kind of waffling. She didn't really push things too much. She most likely voted for the CARES Act. Jimmy Dore says this. CARES Act was basically a $4 trillion corporate bailout. One of the biggest, according to what I read, the biggest upward transfer of wealth in U.S. history. It's horrific. And she probably voted for it. She won't really say it was an unrecorded voice vote. Jimmy Dore thinks that she voted for it. I believe him. Okay, so she's intent on, like any progressive Democrats, building her own brand without really opposing substantially. She talks a good game. She talks about good things I agree with, but she doesn't really push it, or she doesn't organize everything. As an aside, people called Bernie Sanders the organizer in chief. He didn't organize shit. He never stepped out of the political electoral politics. Bernie Sanders could have called for a general strike, and he should have. He had enough political authority to do it. Few people did. And he would have pulled a general strike until we have national health care. But now he was deferential to the Democratic Party. Okay, AOC is a fraud, and I really think that what we're going to have to do is, one of the tests of the left is call out these people, not give in to the flavor of the week. And after AOC, people should leave the Democratic Party. They're always after Bernie is AOC. There's one person after another, flavor of the week to bring people back in. We need to solidly break, and that's where Jimmy Dore comes in. Jimmy Dore is a political comedian. He's been around for a while. He's was with the Young Turks TYT network. This is where, as I understand, he got his start. Young Turks Network was a liberal, still is. It's around a liberal network, I guess. Like their TV channels, TV shows, YouTube channels. Cenk Uygur, associated with Cenk Uygur, Ana Kasparian, a few other people. They came out of the more liberal media, which arose around the second to maybe first Bush administration. Like liberals were talking about the right wing and Rush Limbaugh and all these shock jocks. And like shock jocks, well, we need to counterattack. So there was Air America and a variety of John Oliver and for a variety of liberal or liberal left people came out of it to oppose. Okay, fair enough. Many of these people were still around, moved more to the right or mainstream, especially during the Trump administration. They're not really, or during the Obama administration, they're not adversarial at all. Jimmy Dore is one of the people who moved further to the left. Last year, he broke from TYT, mainly over the Russiagate thing. They were pushing it. He didn't believe it, and he was politics for much further to the left. And to his credit, okay, Jimmy Dore supported Sanders, but critically supported him. And as this 2020 election went on, he was increasingly critical, like very critical. Sanders was weak. One thing, he Russiagated himself. There was one point accusation. Supposedly there were some accusation. Supposedly FBI or somebody said there were Russian influence in the Sanders campaign. They were trying to bolster Sanders against Biden. It was clearly nonsense, but Sanders, instead of aggressively counterattacking, he agreed with it. I want to tell Mr. Putin to leave my campaign alone. Like, what? I mean, he was Russiagating himself effectively. That was a horrific, horrible, huge damage to his own campaign. There were many times he could have really aggressively attacked Biden, and he didn't. He didn't. My good friend Joe Biden. He said some good. Sanders always says some good things. Dore kind of support him, but very increasingly critical, and became increasingly disgusted by him. Such a weak campaigner. As I said, Sanders didn't organize anything. There were times he could have organized them, and he didn't. He kept his campaign within the context of what was acceptable to the Democratic Party. And then famous how he lost. Now, after he dropped out, he endorsed Biden without making any demands, without demanding anything. And you give away all your chips. And Dore was like enraged by this. No qualifications. I endorse Joe Biden without making demands on him and without anything. And it was horrible. Later on, I think Sanders kind of complained. Well, Sanders actually said really stupid stuff like Biden presidency will be the most progressive administration since FDR, which is complete nonsense. If you know Biden's history, 40-year history of very pro-right-wing bolstering racist security state, Biden famously was responsible, designed the architecture of mass incarceration. Ramped up. It started under Reagan, was ramped up under the Clinton administration. Biden once said that, as well, a lot of the mass incarceration is due to local police. And yeah, that's true. But his 1994 crime bill, allocated $2 billion for ramping up local police. Drug laws, Biden was tightening up the drug laws, famously super anti-drug, the Patriot Act. And Biden designed the system which Trump walked through, which Trump used. That's why I think, Biden was probably forces behind Biden are far more insidious. Not that I have any support for Trump. Okay, anyway, Jimmy Dore brought up this stuff. And I think he was absolutely right. And he had some allusions in Tulsi Gabbard. He even said this himself. Tulsi Gabbard was a from Hawaii. Um, she was kind of an anti-interventionist. She actually called out RussiaGate, supported Assange, criticized U.S. role in Syria, which all these things you're not supposed to do. And she said she made something of ripple. She probably appealed to his anti-interventionist sentiment in the U.S. military, seemingly. Okay, well, anyway, Dorr probably had some illusions in her, possibly was emotionally attracted to her, who knows. But when Tulsi Gabbard endorsed Biden, he Jimmy Dore took it really bad. This radicalized him. This pushed him far out of the Democratic Party. And even in the past 6 months, Jimmy Dore was kind of liberal left, angry liberal left. He moved to the far right. I'd regard him as a comrade. I don't think he's read Marx or Lenin or Trotsky, whatever. Maybe he has by now. But he's an now. I regard him. He's on the far left now. I don't know where he's going to, but so far he's saying some really good stuff. Now, some people don't like him. I do. I like him. But some people he curses a lot, and he's angry. He gets angry. Sometimes it's really funny. His face turns red. It's funny to watch. But it's anger is real, and it's justified. It's fully justified. He gets angry. He attacks the Democratic Party from the left, which they desperately need. No one else is doing this. No one is giving it free pass. Okay. And he goes on these epic rants. So, a couple things. He curses. Personality turns some people off. Okay. Some people can call him an Assad apologist. Now, I remember maybe I don't remember 2018, maybe, but 2014. I don't remember when. But the ISO, Socialist Organization, which collapsed about 2 years ago of a rape scandal. Anyway, the New York branch of the ISO, which was the most conservative branch, they refused to endorse Howie Hawkins, who was an independent Green Party candidate or independent leftist candidate for governor of New York. They refused to endorse him or support him on the grounds that he accepted an endorsement from Jimmy Dore. I think this was 2018, because Jimmy Dore was an Assad apologist. Like, this is crazy. It wasn't the real reason. There was that transparent reason. Now, okay, as far as being an Assad apologist, and one person criticized Dore, said, he attacks anyone who attacks Putin. Okay, first background, I talked about U.S. imperialism, and it's devastated in the last couple of decades, last couple of years, devastated whole societies. There's nothing like it. Most countries in the world have crappy anti-worker governments. Yeah, Iran, Russia. Yeah, they do. I totally agree. But, okay, the U.S. role in Syria, let's examine it. And the Syrian civil war is extremely complicated, and could take another 5 or 6 videos to cover it. And what happened is basically mass protest movement emerged in 2011. I support it, and I'm not an Assad fan. I supported Max Blumenthal, who's usually called an Assad apologist. He said Assad ran a brutal police state. Max Blumenthal says this. What happened is from 2011 to maybe 2015, there was something called Operation Timber Sycamore, where the U.S. spent $5 billion in close cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, funding these basically jihadist groups. And U.S. has been doing stuff like this for years. And earlier, from about 2011, the U.S. spent at least $5 billion fostering these. And even way back when 1946, I believe, the French got out, the U.S. orchestrated two coups in Syria pretty early on. And one of the motivations for Syria joining Egypt, Egypt was a United Arab Republic back then, was fear of U.S. meddling. So U.S. has had a long involvement in Syria, and bears some of the responsibility for regimes like Assad or North Korea, reaction to devastating U.S. meddling. So the U.S. fostered these jihadi groups in Syria, and there was no moderate opposition, except at the very beginning. There was no moderate opposition, no secular opposition. It's just snuffed out very early on. And U.S. didn't create ISIS, but certainly created the conditions for ISIS existing, for ISIS arising. There were some suspicion that U.S. kind of connived at aiding ISIS at times. There's one story. There's in Dallas, Texas. There was a guy who ran a plumbing supply company. Forget his name, but he had this fleet of trucks which he sold. And he sold the fleet of trucks under the condition that the markings be taken off, like his name, the name like Joe's Plumbing, and the name of his company and phone number and stuff be taken off. So okay, sold it under the condition that his markings be painted over or removed. Okay, so like 4 months later, local TV stations started showing his trucks being driven by ISIS in Syria. Like, how did this happen? And being Texas, he got death threats from people. He explained, I had nothing to do with this. ISIS did pick up, overran U.S. bases, or somehow or they picked up a huge amount of U.S. military equipment, fleets of Toyota trucks and things like that. Huge quantities of military equipment. Nobody quite knows how this happened. So it's a little odd. Anyway, so people were really, ISIS morphed into a major controlled a big chunk of Iraq and Syria. It was largely defeated by the Russians. U.S. played a role, bombing Raqqa, Russia pushed back U.S. imperialism. Now, I'm not a fan of Putin, but any country I would support them as far as they push back U.S. imperialism is the main enemy. U.S. imperialism is overwhelmingly the main enemy. Other countries, Putin's Russia is a crappy anti-worker government, so are a lot of other places. But understand the proportion of forces, and I'm going to do a future video on U.S. imperialism. I'm a Trotskyist. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Trotsky had a famous interview, I think in 1938, with, I think it was a British magazine, I don't remember, but it's titled Learn to Think. He basically said proposed a hypothetical situation where a Brazil ruled by a fascist government would have a war with so-called democratic Britain. And back then the British Empire was still huge and the center of capital accumulation. It was moving towards the United States, but the British Empire was still really powerful. And he said in a situation like that, a war between a fascist Brazil and a democrat Britain, you support Brazil. And I think he would say some of the same stuff today. I mean, it's horrible on all sides, but U.S. imperialism is still enormously powerful. Anything that pushes that back, you can't, substitute class struggle for geopolitics, and that's what tankies do, or some people do. I don't believe that, but I believe geopolitics is part of it. Like the protests in Syria when the Islamists were pushed back. The protests revived. They couldn't protest when the Islamists were there. The protests revived. And many of the protesters temporarily made their peace with Assad, like, we don't like you, but the Islamists are actually a lot worse. Max Blumenthal had an video of a tour of a Christian neighborhood outside Damascus. And if the Islamists one that would snuffed out, he showed like a secular space where different religions and cultures could combine. That would have been something valuable, worth keeping. As bad as Assad might be, that's something really worth keeping. Now, why Dore was criticized, there were two. He exposed or disagreed with the media narrative. First, the White Helmets, so as a humanitarian aid group that won all kinds of international prizes, and they were apparently a hoax cooked up by British intelligence. Stuff came out. And more recently, there were two whistleblowers of the OPCW, Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Warfare. They had some really credible doubts on the narrative of Assad gassing his own people. Obama kept saying, red line, U.S. would only get involved if poison gas is used. He kept saying that. That's the red line. That practically guarantees, invites a poison gas attack. And sure enough, it happened. Some of the scenarios don't quite make sense. There's so many holes in the argument. Very complicated. But anyway, he had people on who were pushing back against this narrative, which is why the ISO was a third campus group, and there are people like that today, and they hate this. Now, whatever you think about Assad or Syria, it's, the monumental crimes, ocean of blood of U.S. imperialism is just staggering levels, and to pick up, well, he's an apologist for Assad. He gets Assad wrong. That's kind of a ridiculous thing to use against him. Even if you disagree with him, it's kind of relatively minor. And he's not defending Putin. He's not defending Putin. He barely mentions Putin. He doesn't even talk about Syria that much. But he's had people on who disagree with the narrative. He's had people, Aaron Mate especially, who dissect the Russiagate narrative and tear it to pieces and break credit as Russiagate's complete horseshit. And he exposes all the Democratic journalists who are covering for the Democratic Party, mostly hacks, corrupt hacks, and he's 100% correct.